welcome to this conversation, Jeff. We're so excited to hear about your work and research and get your perspective on the climate agenda and strategy for the incoming president. Tell us first quick intro about your work at the Climate Solutions Lab.
Thanks so much for having me on. So I am a professor at Brown University and the director of a brand new Climate Solutions Lab that has just started this year. It's housed at our Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs. And the social scientists here are trying to bring our knowledge of energy, trade, finance, development to this really difficult problem that we want to address.
I'm so glad that you're coming into this, yes, very difficult problem with a very clear set of solutions and a lot of hope. So let's start with your advice to the next president of the United States. You've outlined 10 executive actions that the president can take without the help of Congress to put climate at the center of U.S. foreign policy. What are these 10 steps in brief? Well,
so the big message, I will absolutely outline them, but the big message of this report is that there's so much we can do, right? That we often hear so much doom and gloom about how difficult the problem is, and it is a hard one. And yet, if the political conditions allow, there's so much that Congress and firms and cities and states, and of course the US president can do. And so to name them very quickly, and I won't exhaust anybody by going through them in detail, but very quickly, number one is to create an international climate club of countries that will commit to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and use tariffs, trade tariffs, to punish non-participants. Number two is to rejoin the World Health Organization and to make climate change central to its operations. Number three is to end routine natural gas flaring and reduce methane leakage. Number four is to protect the Amazon rainforest by working with Brazil and the international community to put pressure on deforestation efforts, which unfortunately are continuing. Number five is declare a US national climate emergency to help unlock presidential powers to modernize and secure our electrical grid. Number six is to direct the Federal Reserve, the Fed, to mitigate climate risks to our financial system so that we don't have a kind of 2008 financial crisis that's caused by climate risks. Number seven is to mitigate climate risks to our financial system in lots of other ways besides just what the Fed can do. And there's a bunch of those. Number eight is to launch a new partnership of the world's 10 leading democracies, the so-called D10, and to make climate change central at that organization. Number nine is to decarbonize aviation and the shipping sectors by working with Europe primarily, advanced democracies especially. And the last one, number 10, is to address environmental migration, which is going to become an increasing issue when we see, as the New York Times predicts, up to 30 million migrants on the US southern border by the year 2050. So those are the 10.
Just a few suggestions. Right?
Yeah.
So that's a lot, and especially at a moment when we know that there's concern about presidents acting unilaterally or challenging the democratic process. Let's actually just begin by kind of addressing what are the optics and of this and the challenges of this kind of bold executive action, if particularly on the first day that the president enters office. I mean, how viable is it that a president could really just hammer out those 10 agenda points right away?
Well, a lot is going to depend, of course, on the political conditions that he faces in Congress, right? And if Congress is unified around an agenda of acting on climate change, then yes, then the president might be able to sort of let Congress take the first step and do that. But if Congress is not in that situation, and unfortunately we've gotten used to that situation over the last 25 years of failure at the congressional level to really address climate change, then I think it's actually a very easy sell for the president to make to the American people to say, look, this is a serious issue that we have to work on. And if Congress won't act, then I will. And that's something that I think, Washington tends to get obsessed about how things are done, Washington insiders, but the American people care about what you do and what solutions you provide.
Well, we'll get into some of that. Like, what would it take to say, hello, guys, I'm here in the Oval Office and I'm going to declare a national emergency. And, what that would look like and how that would play out. But if the incoming president could do only one or two of these 10 actions, what should they be?
Well, number one is the International Climate Club, right? That's the thing that makes this different from previous efforts. Even the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement are unfortunately kind of toothless, right? That unfortunately they depend on countries deciding on their own to live up to them. Whereas this says, look, if you're a member of this club, you have to meet some minimum standards of pro-climate policy. You have to put on a carbon tax, or you have to have a cap and trade system, or you have to have equivalent regulations. And then you're in the club. If you're not going to do that, if you're going to stay outside of the club, then you're going to face tariffs on any goods you try to export inside of the club. And that means you might lose access to the United States and European market, which is where 50% of the world's GDP is. And so that's where exporters around the world, of course, want access to it. And that's where it's got real bite, is that if you don't actually live up to some climate promises, then you're going to face tariffs. And this is something that one of the candidates, Joe Biden, has already promised to do unilaterally. What we're saying is that we should do this, and Europe is also saying that they're going to do it unilaterally. What we're saying is that we should work together, right? Multilateralize this.
And how many members do you see in this club? And what would, again, do you really think that that the sort of threat of being in or out of the club would have that kind of diplomatic sway and it seems to me that it could be yet another sort of non-binding, somewhat ambiguous act of diplomacy.
So what's great about this is that it doesn't take the whole world to be a member of it. We don't need to negotiate with 192 members. We need to start with the most willing actors, which of course are in Europe, right? So if the US and Europe could start by saying, we're going to be forming a climate club, and if you want access to our markets, which again are 50% of the world's economy, then you need to start to respond to the incentives we're setting up. But to really make this work, we also need China, right? Because China is responsible for somewhere between 25 and 28% of the world's of the emissions, right? The greenhouse gas emissions. And so we want China to be inside the climate club. And fortunately, we've seen some positive signals from Beijing, where they are the ones who have promised to get to a net zero emissions economy by the year 2060. They made that promise last month in September. The United States is behind the game in that respect. We haven't made that same promise. And so really to make this work, the first step, of course, is for the US to get its own house in order and to show that we're going to be serious about leading on climate.
Yeah, I saw that foreign affairs post that you put up recently, arguing that the U.S. should not sever trade ties with China, and that would cripple global climate governance. And you're indicating that you think that's feasible. How feasible, right? I mean, what would it take to get China in the club, and what kind of backroom relationship would have to be cultivated for that?
Yeah, so the idea of decoupling is kind of being bandied about, right? Is that we should sever ties with China. But that's a move that you can sort of only do once, right? If you cut off trade ties, then you can't do it again. And what I'm saying is that we want China to work with us on climate change and to be a member of this climate club. And so we need to have that potential threat in our back pocket and say, if you don't join the climate club, then it is going to cost you access to the US economy. But we can't make that threat if we've already done it. And if we've already done it for what are lower priority reasons, right? So what I'm saying is that we should keep our powder dry and really focus on what is an existential threat to our country and to humanity as a whole.
One of the most provocative suggestions is that the president comes in on day one, declares a national emergency, which would unlock statutory powers that would enable him, unless something unexpected happens, and it would be her, enable the president to rapidly modernize the electrical grid. Can you elaborate on this? What are the statutory powers that the president could take hold of with this national emergency declaration? And then beyond that, let's talk about decarbonizing the energy economy and how to approach that.
Well, first thing to recognize is that presidents declaring a national emergency is not unusual. In fact, almost all presidents have declared a national emergency of some type or another.
Maybe
so
not
this
on day one. Maybe not, but
right. So this potentially unlocks 123 statutory powers, which of course I'm not going to try to name all of them. But one thing that allows the president to do is to redirect some resources, some money from the Department of Defense towards things that the president says are in the national security interests of the United States of America. And we think climate change is a clear threat to the national security of the country. And so diverting some revenues, of course, we don't want to gut the military, but diverting some defense revenues towards a priority like modernizing the electrical grid is really crucial for unlocking the renewables revolution, right? We're already seeing solar and wind costs come way down. They actually beat, the cost of coal production, coal-fired electrical production in most cases. And yet the renewables can struggle if they don't have an electrical grid that allows for integration across different parts of the country, where maybe one part of the country, the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, but in other parts it's not. And so you need to be able to send electricity across those grids. And right now we have huge obstacles to that. And so that's something that is exactly the kind of thing that government ought to be stepping in and providing.
Yeah, and let's think about beyond upgrading the grid and creating the infrastructure necessary to decarbonize the economy or the energy economy. At the debate last night, we saw Trump and Biden clashing when the former vice president said that that he would transition away from the oil industry. And Trump implied that this would be economically catastrophic near term. What are the potential job losses and gains from shifting away from fossil fuels and toward renewables? We know that there are amazing long-term benefits to this transition, and we know, but near-term, realistically, how disruptive will it be?
Well, the first thing to think about is that this is going to be a transition. And so the idea that this is going to crater our economy in the short term is just not true, because no one would want to close down every fossil fuel business in the country tomorrow. That would be not in anybody's plan. And so the thing to recognize is that already the United States has more jobs in renewables, in the green, clean energy sector than it does in the oil industry. And so there are jobs available in the sort of clean energy revolution. And it's up to us to actually try to set up the incentives where jobs over time move towards a cleaner energy system and away from an industry that has served us well, that we should be proud of, but ultimately needs to go away, because it is creating a global problem.
So I wrote a piece for World Road Zero's Frontline magazine, in which I include statistics that are somewhat consistent with what you were saying. The solar industry has grown an average of 50% annually since 2010. There are now more than 750,000 jobs in the US renewable energy sector. That's neck and neck with telecommunications. Solar and wind sectors alone outnumber those in coal and gas in 30 states. Do you think it's fair to say that we are winning on renewable energy? And you mentioned the grid as a crucial barrier to progress to this transition. What are the other crucial sort of barriers to progress that need to be addressed?
Well, we're winning in one sense, in that, I mean, you're absolutely right that solar and wind are beating out coal, and so they're competing economically in a really important way. But we're not winning in a couple of other ways. So for instance, we see that China is the world's leader by a very wide margin of producing wind turbines and solar cells. And here in the United States, we are not taking advantage of the potential that we have to tap our renewable energy sources. So for instance, I live in Rhode Island. Rhode Island is home to the only offshore wind project in the country. So that's great news, but it's a 30 megawatt project. And the National Renewable Energy Laboratory estimates that Rhode Island has a potential of something like 2.5 gigawatts. Now I'm getting the numbers wrong on this, but the number that stays with me is that we are currently at about 0.1% of the potential that we have. So there's so much room to grow in renewables, and it's up to us to get out there and grab it.
And again, what are your thoughts about the sort of erosion of jobs in fossil fuels and transitioning to renewables? I mean, do you think it has to be a gradual transition, but how do you absorb the impact on the fossil fuel industries and help address the losses there?
Yeah, so it not only has to be a gradual transition, it has to be a just transition, right? It has to be a transition that treats the workers in those sectors with dignity and gives them opportunities and in ways that are, that allows for good paying jobs. What's important, though, is to distinguish between the needs of Americans and American workers versus the needs of companies. If some companies go out of business, that's all right. That's part of capitalism. And some businesses, the really dirty and polluted ones, do need to go away. And maybe not even in the long term. Some of them need to go away tomorrow. And that's part of what an economy looks like. And so there is a role, I think, for government to make sure that there are paths, if you have a job in that sector, to make sure that there are just as good jobs elsewhere doing green energy building retrofits, solar, wind installations, those kinds of jobs, which are an increasing part of the economy.
So in your 10 actions that you suggest for the next president of the United States on climate, you say that that he should direct the Federal Reserve to address systemic financial risks created by climate change. Can you outline the most significant systemic financial risks that are posed by climate change and how to address those, how the Fed can address those?
So we're in something of a doom loop right now with the financial sector that is continuing to lend and finance the fossil fuel sector, which is contributing to climate change. And then climate change is hurting the valuation of assets. So that's one way of thinking about its effects on, say, coastal real estate that are getting swamped by rising sea levels, increased hurricanes, and of course, the wildfires on the West Coast that we saw this year also being hurt by climate change. And the worry for the financial sector is that there might come a moment where the financial sector suddenly wakes up to the kinds of climate risks that are currently already baked in to our financial system and dramatically readjusts its valuation of certain assets and creates a cascade of mortgages or other loan failures that creates a serious financial crisis like the one we saw in 2008, except maybe 3 or 4 times the size of that, right? So really a serious one. And that's the kind of thing that we need to avoid and head off at the pass, because we know those risks are already present, and we have to get on board with that, the fact that around the world, every major central bank has started to address those risks, except the Federal Reserve.
Right.
And so there's need to do that.
And tell me a bit more about what the barriers would be. I mean, to get the Federal Reserve to take on those financial risks. I mean, how would that play out?
Well, Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, has actually already indicated that he's kind of willing to move in that direction, but he says that the political climate is not the situation where he wants to do it right now. So I think a different president could direct the Fed to do so without any pushing on an open door, right? Without any real resistance.
Okay, that easy, low-hanging fruit right there.
Exactly. And
I have to ask what your take is on Biden's climate plan. Specifically, what do you see as the strengths of his plan and the weaknesses of the plan?
Well, the strength is that it is the most ambitious plan on climate change of any presidential candidate in history. And so he gets full marks on that. And on top of that, he understands that there's a link here between climate change and jobs that we need to focus on. That the move towards a clean energy economy is going to provide jobs. It's going to take some investment, of course, public investment, but it's also going to generate jobs, and that's going to be good for the economy. So, big credit in that regard. But there are things that where he could go further. And then, since that was the genesis, the motivation for our report, where we said, look, we give him credit for what he's already done, but the 10 things that we outline are things that he hasn't yet pledged to do, and that we hope he would do if he were the candidate. We also, if not just the candidate, if you were the president, right? If you were the occupant of the White House. But it's not just about Biden. It's also about anybody, Republican or Democrat, to recognize that there are things that we can do on climate change, and the ideas are there. It's just a matter of getting it done.
So you're making me think about this amazing video that Sarah Cooper posted with World War Zero about Trump's climate denial, and she lip synced an interaction between Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes and Trump. I believe that interview is going to be airing this weekend. But she opens with an explanation of why he's not addressing climate change, and he says, "I don't want to lose millions and millions of jobs." Did you see this video?
Well, Sarah Cooper is a national treasure, and yes, I saw the video. I loved it. I think, of course, he's wrong about his claim on losing millions and millions of jobs. It's exactly the kind of scare tactics that, if you're in bed with the fossil fuel industry, as unfortunately his party is, then that's the kind of thing that you say. But in fact, as we know, there are good jobs available in the renewable sector, and it's up to us to go get it.
And I mean, Biden has implied that not only is approaching climate change in a very serious manner, not an engine for job loss. In fact, it might be the most important of job creation engine. The most important engine of job creation of this century. Do you think that that's an overstatement?
I don't, actually. I think he's exactly right, because we're looking at a challenge that is not going to be solved, even under the most aggressive plan that I could, get behind. It's not going to be solved in 2 years or 4 years or 6 years. This is a long-term challenge. We have to get started very soon, but it is something that is going to be a long-term process, and that's why retooling the U.S. economy in the right direction is going to be an engine of growth and jobs if we do it right. There's so much that we can do that is kind of net positive for our economy, or low cost in the short term with big returns, right? So yes, there are things that we could do that would be enormously expensive, but we don't have to do that, because there's so much, as you say, your phrase, low-hanging fruit, right? That there's things to do.
climate scientist Michael Mann has said that a second Trump term is game over for climate. What do you agree? Why or why not? And what are the avenues for progress and hope if, in fact, Trump has a second term?
Well, I do think that a second Trump term is going to make it much harder to make climate change progress. And it's also, I mean, look, the first presidential term under Trump has hurt the U.S. standing around the world, right? As public opinion polls from countries in our allies and in our rivals have shown around the world, U.S. opinion or U.S. standing is sinking. And that hurts our ability to move forward on climate change. But even more importantly, if we had 4 more years of climate denialism or the kind of wishy-washy uncertainty about whether there really is a scientific basis for anthropogenic, human-caused climate change, then yeah, we're not going to get the kind of progress that we need to have. The only thing that I would push back on a little bit with Michael Mann's statement is not to think about this as, it's all or nothing proposition. This is a long-term game. We need to get started soon, right? I mean, today or yesterday, but it's just a matter of, if we don't do it today, it gets harder and harder and harder. And that's why the fact that we haven't acted on this in the last 15 years has painted ourselves into a corner and made it so much harder. And it's a real tragedy. So let's not replicate that tragedy in the next 15 years.
So it would be up to states. I mean, based on what President Trump has said publicly about his position on climate change, it would essentially put a lot more pressure on states to, address climate in a piecemeal way. That's right.
And, as you say, the "we are still in" movement, which is, alluding to the Paris Agreement, that was the states and the cities that said, okay, even if Donald Trump is going to try to remove us from the Paris Agreement, we are still going to take the actions that are consistent with the Paris Agreement. And so a second Trump term would probably look like that as well.
Interesting. So state by state adoption of those goals. And if you were, Jeff, to sit down with President Trump and make the case to him, if he indeed got reelected for a second term, make the case to him for your 10 executive actions on climate, how would you do that? Well, I'm assuming you might want to invite Ivanka into the room, given her enthusiasm for the topic. But how would you make this case to him?
Well, I'd probably be terrible at it, let's be honest, but I would at least start with the idea that the costs of inaction are real and they are much larger than the cost of action. The economic costs, yeah. So the costs of inaction on climate change are real, and some of his favorite measures of success, like the degree to which the stock market is rising, I would say, look, that's at risk if you continue to ignore climate risks. We need to address those risks so that you don't see a big drop in the stock market. And that's going to make you look bad, Mr. President, because of course we know how image conscious he is. And to really focus on those kinds of indicators to him that this is a problem that needs to be addressed. It's also worth saying, and just politically, we are starting to see openings on the Republican sides. People like Senator Marco Rubio, who of course is from Florida and sees some of the effects of climate change and how serious that can be on the coastal coastal property of Florida. There's interest there in actually coming around to have some solutions on climate change and to take action there, because more and more voters in the US, especially young voters, thankfully, are seeing climate change as a top priority, as something that has to happen. And that's true even in the Republican Party.
And in fact, historically, there have been any number of Republican presidents who have enacted cornerstone environmental regulations and have been, or have championed and worked with Congress to pass them. And you know, as many conservatives say, conservation and bold environmental policies is a conservative value, and it's something that conservatives have held dear for decades, if not longer.
Yeah, if you think about the conservationist movement, which was the sort of original name of the environmental movement, that started with Teddy Roosevelt, who was a Republican president and created the national park system, and often called America's best idea. And then Richard Nixon, Republican president, was the creator of the Environmental Protection Agency. Yeah. And so there is a tradition there in the Republican Party that a smart political leader could grab hold of.
So Amy Coney Barrett made some concerning remarks about climate change at the SCOTUS hearings. She called climate change controversial, and her perspectives on the topic are irrelevant, is what she indicated. But of course, most Americans say that climate change affects their local community, and including 70% of the population living near coasts. What is your response to Barrett's comments, and what would Barrett's confirmation mean for Biden's climate plan if he were to be elected president?
Well, I think the power of Kamala Harris's line of questioning there, I forget the exact setup she had but she asked, do you believe in, the laws of gravity or, other sort of well-established scientific facts? And she said yes, and she said yes. And then Kamala Harris asked her, do you believe in climate change? And she dodged. And that's the tragedy, because the debate about the science of climate change and the attribution to human-caused climate change, it's really over, right? The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the US National Academy of Sciences, the Royal Academy of Science in the UK. You go around the world, it's just overwhelming that this is what the scientists are telling us. And yet, unfortunately, what we've seen in the Trump administration is that some political leaders just don't want to listen to the science. And we've seen that on climate change. We've unfortunately been experiencing it also with COVID. And that's the reality.
So, what though would it mean? What would her confirmation mean in terms of, what would that, do to the Biden plan and a lot of the goals that are set up, and as you say, the most ambitious climate plan ever proposed by a presidential candidate?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that there is a risk here that a Supreme Court that has a 6-3 conservative judge advantage would strike down a lot of environmental regulation. That's a risk, and it's one that we should take very seriously and that voters should think about when they're deciding on November 3rd if that's something that they want to face. And I think it's not surprising that Joe Biden has said that he would take seriously the idea of court reform and Supreme Court reform. He said so again, I think last night in the debates, and that's something that's unfortunately been driven by the Republicans in the Senate, who have, particularly Senator Mitch McConnell, who have maneuvered shamelessly to put a particular spin on judges. And so that's a real issue, but that's something that, doesn't matter who is in the White House or in Congress. If judges are going to behave that way, then it's going to be a tough road for climate change.
And can you give some examples of exactly how the Supreme Court could inhibit the kind of progress Biden has pledged to make on climate change?
Well, it's worth pointing out actually that let me give the upside first. It's actually rare for presidential executive orders on the environment to be struck down in the court. So of the 25 or so that have been issued in the last 20 years, none of them, or maybe one of them, has been struck down in the courts. The bigger risk, unfortunately, is of the next president coming in and reversing the executive order. Even that is quite rare, or at least it was rare until Donald Trump became president. And so he's been the most aggressive in doing that, at least with respect to environmental executive orders. But you're right. There could, of course, be challenges at the court. The Obama plan, Clean Power Plan, did go to the Supreme Court, and it was at least limited. I'm not sure if it was completely overturned, but it faced challenges there. And anything like the Biden plan of a $2 trillion investment in clean energy and in moving towards tighter regulations around greenhouse gas emissions, that could all be up for challenge at the Supreme Court.
It's very sobering. Thank you for taking us through that. So we only have time for 2 more questions, and I want to very briefly touch on an important action that you propose, which is to partner with Brazil to protect rainforests in Brazil and this crucial carbon sink. Can you quickly touch on that, and then maybe address any other land management issues that you think need to be priorities, ways in which the president, if not Congress, can help establish agricultural sinks in U.S. farms, for example? Just jump on that just a bit before we wrap up.
So the Amazon rainforest is, of course, a global treasure. It's sort of the lungs of the world. And under the current Brazilian president, deforestation is not only continuing, it's actually on the uptick, right? It's rising. There's less enforcement of the rules against kind of hack and slash deforestation. There's more economic incentives and permission to do. And on top of the intentional deforestation, this year we also had a raging wildfire in the Pantanal, which is 10% of Brazil, that happened because, again, of climate change. So we have these feedback loops where the deforestation is contributing to climate change, and then the climate change is now contributing to wildfires that lead to deforestation. And so that's exactly the kind of feedback loop that we want to avoid. And the U.S. should work with the international community to really put pressure on Brazil to say, look, you've got to take this seriously. And some of the things that you want Brazil to act on this aren't going to happen unless you do that, right? So for instance, Brazil wants to be a member of the OECD, right? The Organization for Economic and Cooperation and Development, sort of a club of rich countries. Mexico is a member, and of course Europe and North America mostly are members. We could just say, listen, you're not going to be a member of OECD unless you're willing to really act on deforestation.
It just goes to show how crucial diplomacy is in solving the climate crisis, and how destabilized. Sorry about this shifting of the camera.
It's all right.
Get my charger in there.
You're making me feel like I'm not the only one who's struggling with Instagram Live, so that's good.
Well, you got to have the power, as you say. None of it can happen without an electrical grid and without clean power supplying it. So, but it's so important that the role of foreign policy in these solutions is absolutely crucial, and it doesn't get enough focus. And I so appreciate your walking us through these ideas. Now, we only have 3 minutes, and I wanted, as a professor also of undergrads and grad students, I'm curious about the influence that your students have on your work. I find that what makes me most hopeful, certainly, about our climate future is the way my students and other young people are transforming the climate movement and making climate solutions inextricable from social justice solutions, and really emphasizing intersectionality. They're making the case that it's a deeply human issue, and a moral imperative. And I'm curious, how are your students influencing your perspective and your work?
I'm so glad you asked. Number one, I have to say that I think Brown University students are just the best, and I'm totally biased on this perspective.
I'm gonna interrupt there as a former Brown University student and say I sort of agree, except for I'm now a professor at Vanderbilt University. I'm going to say neck and neck.
Fair enough. But I find it so energizing. You know, I'm actually teaching a politics of climate change course this semester. It's the first time I've taught that course, and I find it so energizing because the students do bring a passion to it that excites me, and they bring perspectives on it that I hadn't thought of, right? That they make me think about the issues in different ways. And as you said, they see it from a social frame. They see the fact that it does intersect all kinds of racial issues, social issues that I hadn't thought of, and that are so important, right? So one thing that I did, partly in reaction to the Black Lives Movement this summer, was to make sure that my syllabus was going to be deeply connected to different perspectives, different racial perspectives, and connect to the idea that climate change disproportionately affects the Black population, and that Black voters care about climate change disproportionately, right? That they are the leading edge on this. And so that's really important to recognize, and that the movement for climate change gets stronger if we have a broader coalition, and we bring in a whole population to try to fight this really difficult challenge.
It's really well said. Thank you for that. And as we just sign off here, what can you just put into perspective? We keep hearing that this is the most important presidential election, and of course there are so many other elections that are coming up alongside the presidential election. But this is the most important election season, probably of our lifetimes. What does that mean relative to climate? How important are these elections? And I will just bring this up.
Yes, I noticed your necklace earlier.
We know that a lot of early voting is in progress. We're seeing incredible turnout. But why is this so crucial as it relates to climate?
Yeah, I think probably the most important thing that we could possibly say today is the word vote, right? So your necklace is exactly the right thing. I wish I had a matching one or some accessory that said the same thing. It's really important that the choice on climate change in this election could not be more stark, right? There's never been a bigger difference on this issue in any previous election. And so that choice is really important. But even more deeply, there is a sense in which, and I think there is a reality in which, that democracy itself, the rule of law itself, is on the ballot. And so voters should take it very seriously, and most especially young voters should take it seriously, because this is the issue that's going to be with them for decades. You know, the older voters haven't delivered yet. And so we really need to see the whole of society take the election seriously, know that elections have consequences, and your vote matters.
Well, thank you. Vote. I'll put it up there again in the final frame here. And thank you so much, Jeff. Your op-ed for World War Zero is really cogent and important, and the work you've been doing at the Climate Solutions Lab at Brown is really instrumental to our future and our survival, if we want to just get right down to it. So thank you for that, and thank you for taking the time to walk us through your ideas and encourage us to head to the polls.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much. Especially, it's a pleasure to be interviewed by someone with great talent, but also a Brown alum. So appreciate that.
Yes. Brunonians unite.
Indeed.
All right. Hope to see you. I wish I could go grab a sandwich on Thayer with you. I miss Thayer a lot, and of course getting sandwiches in public places.
Right.
So,
Thayer Street looks a little different this year, I got to tell you.
yes, well, fewer lines, I'm sure.
Right.
All right, have a great day, and thank you again, and until next time.